Hey everyone, welcome to week two's lecture for corrections. And this week, through the readings, which were just a reminder, chapter 1, specifically chapter 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, 1.5, as well as 1.8, as well as all of chapter 4. That's all in text 1. And then text 2 was unit 2, and we'll look at that here in just a minute. But the overall discussion for this week and from the readings is going over the philosophy of corrections. And so we've kind of talked about this already before. So we're just diving right in with I mentioned it last time. If you've taken Intro to Criminal Justice or you've taken other criminal justice courses, we've talked about theories of punishment before. And so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about what each of these means, but we are going to go over briefly just so that we're all on the same page. So, the four main theories of punishment are incapacitation, deterrence, rehabilitation, and retribution. The idea behind incapacitation is that through the act of arresting or holding an individual, that you are incapacitating, you are holding them so that they cannot commit a crime or commit further crimes. Deterrence is the idea that the punishment for committing a crime is so severe that it will deter or turn away potential individuals who would commit it to no longer commit. So the idea of deterrence is that you are making people not want to engage in that criminal behavior based solely on the punishment of said crime. So that's the idea of, well, the death penalty is the harshest possible sentence you can get. So you would think that nobody would want to commit a crime because, well, they don't want to die. We see that, that doesn't always line up the way that we want it to. And we'll talk about that piece here in a few moments. So retribution, as far as the theory of punishment goes, is the idea that you get a equal punishment to your crime. It's the traditional biblical eye for an eye, the idea that if you commit a crime, you need to be punished in particular on the same level for that crime. Retribution is 100% punishment, not there's no other goal other than to punish an individual. With deterrence, the idea is that the punishment prevents people from wanting to do it or prevent people from wanting to do it again. Incapacitation, the idea is that the punishment prevents you from continuing to act, but retribution is just straight up punishment. And then rehabilitation, which we've talked about a little bit already as well. This is the idea that the punishment, and I'm using air quotes here, the punishment aspect of rehabilitation, of a criminal sanction or a sentence, would be that the individual will go through some kind of reformation, some kind of process where they can become a regular, useful member of society again. So that's the goal of retribution or rehabilitation within the theories of punishment. So, like I said, we've talked pretty much at length about this in Intro to Criminal Justice. This is something that hopefully, this is probably like the fourth or fifth time you've seen this or heard this. Maybe it's only like the third, but by this point, it should sink in that these are the ones that you should know. Pretty straightforward. So going back to the whole, well, deterrence doesn't really work. That's because there's this very important shift in general, and it's evidence based practice. And if you've heard this term before, that's great. If not, that's okay too. This is the actual like definition of what it means to be evidence based practice. So if I can give you a view at 50,000 feet so that you're not just looking at all this text and you're going, okay, well, what am I supposed to get away from this? Evidence based practice is the idea that you use data, you use information that is factual and available, and you make decisions based off of that data. So you don't make decisions just because you think it'll work. You have data that shows it will. So, actual definition. Evidence-based practice is the objective, balanced, and responsible use of current research and the best available data to guide policy and practice decisions such that outcomes for consumers are improved. This is used originally in healthcare and social sciences, but it's gone so many other places. Education talks about evidence-based practice. Criminal justice talks about evidence-based practice. I know it's a social science, but it's also a regular science. Psychology uses evidence-based practice. The whole idea is that the evidence-based practices focus on approaches demonstrated to be effective through empirical research rather than through anecdotal or professional experience alone. So, some terms you might not be familiar with. Anecdotal, this means these are stories, not that they're false stories, but anecdotal is the idea that it's a shared story, just someone's personal experience, personal observation. So, the idea is that this is data that you can look at the numbers and go, oh, this isn't someone saying it. This is actually real numbers, real data. So when we talk about an evidence-based approach, it involves ongoing critical review of research literature to determine what is credible and what policies and practices would be most effective given the best available evidence. And this is important, and why, not just for criminal justice, but for every field of study, for every area of conversation you can have. Critical review of research literature to determine what information is credible. At one point in human history, there was a belief, very briefly, that the earth was flat. There was a brief period of history where we believed that the earth was the center of the universe. There was a brief moment in history where we believed that there was no such thing as an ozone layer, there was no such thing as global warming, there was no such thing as gender identity, there was no such thing as, technically, what was not the African wild dog, but for a long time, scientific evidence shows one thing, but as science gets better, as techniques and methods get better, as we get more data, sometimes what was once credible information is no longer credible. That is not to say that just because it's scientific means it's incorrect. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that looking at what is available, what is actual hard evidence and hard data, critically reviewing all of that information and seeing what does the data say works, that is evidence-based practice. That is saying, okay, well, yeah, 80 years ago, it made perfect sense. You just beat the crap out of a prisoner and they would never cause a problem. Nowadays, that doesn't solve any problem. We see that maybe a more loving approach, a loving hand, treating it like a disease might work better. If you want a real-world example of this, look at how alcoholism and drug addiction is treated. You didn't treat it as a health issue. You treat it as a person's personal shortcoming. That didn't work. It's important just to note that this is important in all areas. So the other thing with doing critical review of research literature, it also involves rigorous quality assurance and evaluation to ensure that evidence-based practices are replicated with fidelity and that new practices are evaluated to determine their effectiveness. If you've never heard the word fidelity before, or the only time you've ever heard it was regarding a wedding, and you're like, I don't know what that means, it means that it is loyal. It is as accurate to as possible. So when we talk about this evidence-based practice, it is repeatable. It can be replicated one-to-one, so there's not like, oh, we had to make some adjustments to make it work. No, you could do it one-to-one, get the same results. And new practices, new ideas, and new tests are evaluated to see if it works. So, in contrast to the terms best practices and what works, evidence-based practice implies one, there is a definable outcome or outcomes. Two, it is measurable. And three, it is defined according to practical realities. Recidivism, victim satisfaction, these are terms that we use in criminal justice that give us these defined according to practical realities, measurable and definable outcomes. What is recidivism? It is the rate at which an individual who has committed a crime is likely to recommit, whether the same crime or a different crime. This is a definable outcome, it is measurable, and it is defined according to practical realities. While these three terms are often used interchangeably, best practice, what works, and evidence-based practice is more appropriate for outcome-focused human service disciplines, criminal justice, psychology, social work, education. This is important to understand. So that really covers all of the rest of chapter 1 that I had you read. So now we're going to talk about chapter 4. And chapter 4 really dives into this alternatives to incarceration. And I'll just kind of tell you right now, this is going to be part 2 of your discussion board. We'll be focused on the alternatives to incarceration, but hopefully it'll make sense here in a bit. So right here, this is just a large overview of the main areas we're going to talk about. So take your time, pause it if you want. We're going to kind of go not necessarily in the order it shows, but in a similar enough order so that you know where we're going. So the first thing, if you've taken a previous criminal justice course, you'll be familiar. We've talked about probation and parole. One of the things that a lot of students end up saying that they learned from Intro to Criminal Justice is that they always thought probation and parole was the exact same thing, and it's not. So obviously this whole thing, Intro to Corrections is all that stuff at the end. So it's important to understand this. So reminder that the biggest difference between probation and parole, probation is an alternative to prison. So it's a community sanction rather than prison sentence. People on probation do not go to prison before they go on probation. They are given probation instead of prison time. Parole, they have served some time in prison and they have been released. However, both of these individuals, probation or parole, if the conditions of said probation or parole is violated, then the individual can be sent to jail, can be sent to prison to finish out whatever their sentence would have been. So that is an important thing to know. So probation itself, just as a area of alternative to incarceration itself, it is community corrections at its core. And so I did want to just briefly bring up, the textbook brings up around 1841, John Augustus. He's kind of seen as the father of modern day probation and things like that. Kind of going back to my example of how we didn't always treat alcoholism as a medical issue. We treated it as a failing of an individual. John Augustus showed up for a person who was really drunk and pretty much started the rehabilitation idea of Alcoholics Anonymous and things like that by, working through it with him, being penitive and, repenting for his sins and becoming sober and things like that. And so the idea that an individual doesn't need to go to jail for everything, but maybe by working with community members and working with individuals outside of an institution can help people not be in prison. That was a whole new idea. And so that's why he's the father of modern probation, just because that's kind of the one that most scholars can point to as, yeah, that's really one of the first times we didn't lock someone up that should have been locked up according to our laws at the time. But that's just a little tidbit here or there. Might be a bonus point question on an exam. You never know. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. But so when we talk about probation and we talk about parole, there is something that's important to know, and that is that there is a level of supervision required. This is where, if you are in corrections and you're thinking about a career in this, the probation officer, parole officer, this is a particular corrections level job, and so part of that is when an individual is on probation or parole, they are supervised by an agent, by an officer, by an individual. And it varies in two different levels. There's active supervision and inactive supervision. Active supervision is daily monitoring. It is random calls, drug screenings, just drop in visits, things like that. They are daily. They are not something that you miss. You miss it, you end up breaking your probation or parole, and then go to prison. Inactive supervision, it doesn't mean that you never check in. It's just, it's more sporadic. It's maybe once a week. Maybe it's 3 times a week. Maybe it's once a week and then twice the next week, and once the week and then twice the next week. Like, the idea is that it is not as intense as active supervision. Active supervision is you are being checked on daily. In some cases, it is, more than once daily. But the idea here is that because you are not being in prison and you are essentially in the community itself, there may be other restrictions, because that's something else we need to talk about. You need to be supervised to make sure you're not breaking your probation or parole. So that's the idea for that. As I said, both probation and parole have particular rules and standards that they have to follow. And so I have conditions of parole down at the bottom, and so that's where I'm going to talk about it. But we're just going to cover parole. So parole is released from prison before completion of a sentence on the condition that parolees abide by certain rules during the balance of the sentence. So when they're released, they serve out the rest of their time out of prison in the regular community. So the goal is to help individuals reintegrate into society as constructive individuals as soon as they're able. So it's people that, you have a 20-year sentence, and 8 years into your sentence, you're pretty much ready to be back out in society. And they're like, all right, we'll offer you parole. You'll serve out the rest of that sentence. So 13 years on parole means, okay, you have 13 years, you have to follow these strict rules, but you're not in jail. So the idea is it also serves to lessen the costs to both society for keeping an individual in prison. So when I say conditions of parole, I'm also referring to conditions of probation, because they often are very similar. These vary from state to state, from case to case, from sentence to sentence. There are some general ones like no drug or alcohol use. If it's a serious kind of offense, and we may be looking at some kind of house arrest, which we'll be talking about here in a second, it might limit where you can and can't go. So you might not be allowed to go, I don't know, maybe you're not allowed to go to a casino. So, that shows up as a place you're not allowed to be, things like that. So the conditions of parole and probation often break down to avoiding things that will tempt or coerce you to commit crime again. Pretty much the idea is that all the rules that are in place are to stop you from potentially going back to prison. Pretty straightforward. So there did not used to be a middle ground between parole and probation. It really was, you either got sent to jail and then could get out early, or you got to stay out of jail but with some pretty strict guidelines. That was it. Intermediate sanctions kind of came in, and they're more of this middle ground. They're still punished more severely than probation, but they're not as restrictive as a prison sentence. And so the two main intermediate sanctions that people tend to know is intensive supervision probation, and I'll talk about that in just a second, and work release program. Obviously, the work release program, if you are not familiar, it is where an individual will be allowed to work, and often the work itself is connected to the state or has some kind of agreement with the state, so that they will take individuals who are convicted of crimes, and essentially they work to pay off their debt to society. They work to pay for their crime. But they have to check in with supervisors, and they still have officers that check in on them. So it's not like, they just, they get a job and that's it. No, they still have things, they have rules like they do on probation and parole. But the idea is that instead of, here, pay $3,000 up front and then pay off the rest, no, your work pays for whatever your sentence would have been. Intensive supervision probation is pretty much if probation had the constant active supervision. That tends to be the intensive supervision probation. These are, constant kind of check-ins, reminders, making sure that you're doing things. This also is where house arrest and electronic monitoring comes in, is under intensive supervision probation. Because reality-wise, an individual cannot be on you 100% of the time. So this is where we have things like house arrest and electronic home monitoring. I know I skipped a slide because I wanted to bring it up right into here. So obviously, home confinement, house arrest as it's called, and electronic home monitoring, it's conditional in nature, which means that, yes, you're out, but there are rules outside of the normal set of rules you'd have in probation or parole. And these pretty much go for you're allowed to leave your home or your area for work, for court, for things like that. But obviously, if you're going out at a random time of night, if you're gone for more than a certain amount of time, or you go more than a certain distance away, it gets alerted and then you're in trouble for it. And so, like, it's more severe. That's why I said it's part of that intermediate. It's harsher than probation, but still less than parole. So obviously, this is an alternative to incarceration. Typically, home confinement is semi-regular supervision. It's more active than inactive, that kind of thing. So something that I passed over real quickly, but I wanted to go back to, was halfway houses. They are often called, the professional term is community correctional centers or residential reentry centers. We've heard of halfway houses before. If you watch television, if you've watched TV about criminals being released and things like that, you've probably heard of halfway houses. These are community corrections. These are facilities that are not really run by the state. They might have some connection with the state, but they're not like a state facility in the traditional sense. We have halfway houses here in Erie. We have them everywhere. Not like we as a city have them everywhere. I mean, these are fairly common. Community corrections are a fairly common thing. And so halfway houses are an intermediate housing option to help people returning from prison to the community after they've served a prison sentence. The idea is that you're not ready to, go back fully on your own. You may not have an apartment or a home to go to, so you have a halfway house where you stay there, and it's conditional that you work a certain number of hours, or if you haven't found a job, you apply for a certain number of jobs every day, that kind of thing. But the idea is that it's to help you return back to the larger community after a prison sentence. This is also a good alternative when a person has served time in prison, is released on parole, and then violates one of their parole conditions. Rather than to send someone for a few extra months into prison itself, if if it was a fairly minor violation of parole, they could send them to a halfway house where they'll be under a more strict monitoring, but instead of being going back into prison, they are just, closer supervision. So it is an alternative for individuals who violate their parole. So in halfway houses, as I've already said, offenders are monitored and must fulfill conditions placed on them by the court. Obviously, the court can set any number of things as long as they're still, constitutional, reasonable, understandable things of that nature. Usually, offenders must remain inside the halfway house except when they are going to court or to a job. So much like house arrest, this is very much the same way for a halfway house. The difference is there's not usually electronic monitoring. That's really for when you're not at a halfway house. So this kind of came up before, but fines and restitution are two particular punishments that are results. Sometimes they are in tandem with going to prison or with parole, probation, and sometimes they're their own actual separate thing. And so, real quickly, the difference between fines and restitution, just in case you do not know or don't remember, fines are paid to the government. Restitution is paid to the community or the victims. So restitution is where you are directly giving some kind of financial return to the individual who has been wronged. Fines are things that you pay to the larger government, whether it's city, state, federal, whatever it may be, to pay for your crime. Now, this is where something interesting comes in. So when we talk about fines in particular, restitution is a whole separate thing because it's the one-to-one. But fines are interesting because there are tariff fines and there are day fines. Tariff fines are flat rate fines. So it might be, 5% of your annual income. For an individual who makes $20,000, that's a lot of money. But for someone who makes $200,000, maybe not so much. And when I say flat rate, it's typically, the regular sentence is $3,000 fine. So let's say, for example, if you illegally block a driveway and you get fined by the city, it is a $3,000 flat rate tariff fine. Now, I don't think that is the accurate fine number. That seems way too high, but let's say it's $3,000 as a flat rate tariff fine if you block a driveway. If any of you right now in my class got fined $3,000 for it, my question to you is, how many of you can pay it right now and not feel any kind of pressure for it? I know I couldn't. That would be terrible. I would be so hard-pressed to pay that. And that's where day fines come in. These are based on your daily income. So what it is they look at the general percentage. So if blocking a driveway was $3,000, they'd go, well, really, what is that percentage? We're looking at 2%. All right. So let's look at your annual income. Let's figure out what you make in a day. And okay, 2% of that is okay. And here is your actual fine that you owe. The idea behind a day fine is it's meant to make it more equal so that everyone feels the same kind of hurt from paying a fine. The idea with a flat rate or a tariff fine is that for a very rich individual, it means nothing. But to everyday citizens and people who are lower, middle, and lower, that's pretty much a death sentence for some people. And so this is the idea, is to make it more equal for everyone. So obviously, community service is another alternative. Obviously, it can be its own punishment, which is often, first offenses, nonviolent offenses, things like that is when you see community service show up. or it can be part of a condition of probation or an alternative to paying restitution or fine. And in case you really don't know what community service is, it is unpaid work. Plain and simple. You offer community service, you offer your time and labor to some individual, some group within the community without getting paid just to do it. If it is a condition of your probation or parole, or it's your alternative to paying restitution or fine, you complete the certain number of community service hours and it is done. So, remember when we said evidence-based practices before? Here's an example of something that has, in sense, gone into disfavor because of evidence-based practice, and that's boot camp. So, if you are an individual who are familiar with military structure or know anything about the military, know about boot camp, you're familiar with this idea. This is not a military boot camp. This is boot camp in air quotes. The idea is that individuals go through a similar regime as military recruits would go through in boot camp, except it's an alternative to incarceration for people who offend. So it's intense daily regimens that include physical exercise, individual counseling, educational classes, and studying for a GED. Like military boot camp, offenders follow strict disciplinary code that requires them to wear short hair and uniforms, stand at attention before their officers, and address their superiors as sir. And once they complete the program and they find a job, they can become eligible for early release. Once they're released, they can be put on probation. So notice, completing boot camp does not immediately finish out your sentence. It just means that if you complete it, you can be eligible for early release. And if you are released from boot camp, then you could be put on probation. This is not an easy thing. This is not I'll just take some hard labor and go through military training for 3 months and I'll be done. No, this is not a easy fix. At the federal level, boot camps are not used in that system and rarely in the state correctional systems. These are few and far between, and this comes down to evidence-based practice. What they find, the data shows that boot camp and the military regime has little to no significant impact on criminal behavior. It doesn't change any of those factors, and so while some people say, well, we'll just get tough on crime, we're gonna beat the crime out of them, the evidence shows that it does not have the impact that people think it does. It's minimal at best, and so we've moved away from it. But it's important to include it so that you understand when we talk about evidence-based practice, this is what we're talking about. This was a common thing for a while, and now it's not really used because we've seen the data shows it's not as useful. So this is another one that's rarely used. Public shaming. If you've been on the internet long enough and you remember pet shaming, by far one of my favorite internet things to go around was pet shaming, where you put up a sign for to shame, in air quotes, your animal for what they did. Really, public shaming, like I said, rarely used, but if they are used, it's low-level misdemeanors. They're intended to deter and, quote, rehabilitate. Obviously, it doesn't really do much. That's why it's rarely used anymore. I would argue if you don't feel typical shame like other people, this is like the least effective punishment ever. But yeah, if you're interested in some public shaming, things that aren't related to criminal justice, and you've never seen pet shaming, look up pet shaming. It'll make you feel a lot better. But public shaming can be, the ever classic Scarlet Letter, which is a literary work about a woman who commits adultery and has to wear a giant scarlet A on her lapel to show that she has committed adultery. They're things meant to show that you are a, quote, bad person to society. All right. So restorative justice is a little further way to go from this, and that's holistic sentencing process. So the idea is that restorative justice is not just meant to punish an individual or to give money to a victim. The idea of restorative justice is to repair harm and bring healing to everyone involved by the crime. Everyone. So, really, and I cannot emphasize enough the goal. The goal of the criminal justice system should be restorative justice. The idea that instead of just punishing an individual, the idea is that we can repair the damage that is done and heal everyone involved. So this is the justice system, victims, offenders, community members. Everyone works together to achieve these goals of repairing harm and bringing healing. And they do this through sentencing circles, which we'll talk about in a second, victim restitution, which you should already know based off of what, restitution is and what a victim is, victim offender mediation, and formalized community service programs. So sentencing circles are when the victim, offender, community members, and criminal justice officials meet and agree on a sentence that actually works, that repairs the harm. The idea is that it's not just a jury of your peers decides your fate or a judge decides the fate. The idea is that everyone has a voice and to come up with a true way to fix the harm, to fix the damage done. And part of this is victim offender mediation. It's a chance that allows the offender and victim to talk to each other and get through this process of apologies and forgiveness. I know some of you are definitely like, well, there's no apology for this. I know it's difficult because not all crimes are equal, and I agree with that. But the idea of restorative justice and a victim offender mediation is to come to a middle ground and understand each other's viewpoints. I'm not saying that, a pedophile should necessarily have a victim offender mediation. I would argue they shouldn't. But a lot of criminal activities, victim offender mediation is tried in a lot of ways because restorative justice is kind of the goal. And so I mentioned pedophiles because it's unfortunately the best way to transition to sexual offender treatment and civil commitment. So sexual offender treatment is broken down in the first part, and then civil commitment is the last piece. But so I've stated this in a different class before, but I'm going to mention it here as well. It is a harsh reality that sexual assault is part of the criminal justice system. It is a difficult subject for a lot of people, and so I'm going to do my best whenever I talk about it to not only talk about it appropriately, but to address it in the best way possible that is the least triggering. I am someone who has a history with this on the victim side, not the offender side. This is something that's difficult for me to talk about. I've gotten to that point over years. So I know it's not easy. So I'm just letting you know if something, when we talk about sexual offenders in any capacity in a criminal justice class, please feel free to let me know if something really made you uncomfortable. If you would like to talk to someone, I'm sure we can schedule, maybe not with me or through me, but I'm sure we do have partnerships with oh my gosh, the Crime Victim Center, things like that. So if you need to talk about it, do know that there is available services out there. Anyway, so when a sexual offender goes through the system, they're often placed on probation if they are not sent to prison. And there are very specific requirements for sexual offenders over the usual kind of things that they're not allowed to do. But so this is the short list that the text gives us. Attend sex offender treatment program, report regularly to probation officer, no contact with victims. They're not allowed to use the internet, and I'll talk about that in just a second, and not allowed to live or work in certain areas. This is where the offensive joke of I'm not allowed to be within 200 feet of a Chuck E. Cheese or a school. You're not allowed to be within a certain distance of individuals who you've offended. So there are very specific rule sets. No use of the internet. This is something that's popped up fairly recently. In the early days of the internet, this wasn't a particular requirement of sexual offender treatment, but with the To Catch a Predator and the use of chat rooms and sharing of child pornography and things like that, there's been a very strong push, and this is why this is usually a very specific requirement across the board for sexual offenders, is that they're not allowed to use the internet. Because the idea is that even if they can't leave where they are, or they have to register with their local area, if they use the internet, they could find another victim, and that's not okay. So, sex offender treatment programs can be inpatient, which means they're residential. So they come in and they stay there, or outpatient, so they're non-residential, and they generally use cognitive behavioral therapy. In case you're not familiar with CBT, it's a very hands-on mental health type of therapy that gets to understanding who you are and why you do things. It's very intense in general, so tends to be something that's used for sexual offenders, particularly pedophiles. Counseling is a part of this, and other approaches to reduce the likelihood that the person will commit another sex offense. Period. Some places have civil commitment. Civil commitment places sex offenders in secure hospitals or residential treatment facilities for treatment. Typically, if a place doesn't have civil commitment, they get released into the larger community, but they have these very specific treatment plans and what they can and can't do. Civil commitment is in few places where you will be forced to stay in a particular area or a particular place for all of this. Excuse me. And so the last real piece of this is the alternative courts. And so we have drug courts and we have mental health courts. Before we had those, all cases came to one large umbrella court, the courts in general. But as we've understood more about mental health and more about drug use and abuse, the creation of these separate courts, the idea was to reduce the number of cases of those that are going to the regular larger court system, to hopefully make it a little more smoother, a little quicker, things like that. So these are specialized courts that places offenders suffering from mental illness, mental disabilities, drug dependency, as in the drug courts as well, serious personality disorders, and court-supervised community-based mental health treatment programs. Mental health courts look at cases that fall under these categories and make sure that they're in the proper program. So this works by court and community supervision combined with professional mental health treatment, whether inpatient or outpatient again. So whether they're, coming in for treatments and then going home, or if they're staying at the facility. Offenders receive rewards for compliance with supervision conditions and are disciplined for non-compliance. It's linked to housing, healthcare, life skills training resources. The idea is that to help with the mental health issue, you're going to prevent relapse and promote overall recovery. Drug courts provide court-supervised drug treatment and community supervision to offenders with substance abuse problems. So drug dependency is part of mental health court, but it also falls under drug court. So depending on what level and how much it's gone, will be in those areas. And so that takes us to Unit 2 from text number 2. That covers, previously that was all of Chapter 4 of text 1. So now we're going to talk about theory. So it is important to note that the reason we do things the way we do, the reason why we come up with programs, the reason why we approach things the way we do is because of theories. And a lot of theories come from other areas. So yes, there are criminal justice theories, there are psychology theories, there are philosophy theories, there are English theories, every area has its own set of theories and whatnot, but there are ways where they overlap, and this is what we're talking about. So correctional theory really brings in sociological, social work stuff, and sociology, psychological theory, which is psychology, and biosocial theory, which is very much biology. And so we're just going to talk in larger terms about these theories because it's important to note that, these are the influences that have led us to understanding how punishment and treatment works and why people commit crimes. So under sociological theories, we have social disorganization theory, and this is the idea that the breakdown in community institutions are a key contributor to criminal behavior. The idea is that social disorganization, if the area where you are living is disorganized and falling apart and not good, then it's going to promote criminal behavior in those areas. But if it's a nice, affluent neighborhood and things are really good and there's not really crime issues, guess what? There's probably not going to be crime issues because it's a fairly good area. It's an interesting theory, and there's more sub things, and we'll talk about them at different times. Strain theory, not string theory, strain theory is an interesting one because the idea with strain theory is that because of different barriers that individuals have, that it leads to a buildup of stress and strain, and it causes higher tensions and eventually resentment and lashing out. So the idea in particular is that the American dream is not available to everyone. Strain theory puts forward that the American dream is designed for a certain individual at a certain financial level, and anyone else that doesn't fit it just has to live with the stress that they can't. And it either leads to resentment as they build up that strain between that relationship and they view it negatively and harshly and lash out and act criminally, or they recognize that it's not available and they don't even try for it and they give up on trying for it, and then they don't feel that kind of resentment towards the rest of society or society at large. So it's important to note strain theory really is all just about how we perceive the world around us, and if we feel like we're not ever going to get what we think we deserve or what we want, it can lead to potentially criminal behavior. So cultural deviance theory is the idea that subcultures develop in deteriorated neighborhoods. This is continuation of social disorganization theory. In particular, cultural deviance theory. This is where we get a lot of the potentially systemic racism thing, where subcultures, cultural deviance, well, aren't certain groups? Yes, from that one standpoint, if you want to view it as systemic racism, there's very strong possibility for it. But let me elaborate on subculture a little bit. Cultural deviance theory doesn't suggest that a particular culture is equal to a race or an ethnicity. Culture and subculture refers to individual groups. This is where, and this is another one of those, it's not correctly understood by a large majority of people. But the thug life subculture is very particular. It supports the idea of crime as glorified, but not everyone that is in that group, in that subculture, is a criminal. But the idea is that these particular subcultures tend to develop and deteriorate in neighborhoods where things are already not good. And so they develop little groups and little gangs, and they work together, they commit crimes together, they cause mischief together, and so they lead to more problems. Differential association theory is that kind of connected to this one, but looks more at adolescence. And the idea is that there's social pressure. And the social pressures during adolescence conform to the environment around them. And so this is the idea that, you are a teenager in high school and one of your friends in high school just stole $50. And so it's like, well, my friend's doing it. People I know are doing it. I need to steal too. It's the idea that the social pressure of fitting in, because that's one of the weirdest human basic instincts, is to belong. The idea that that pressure will make us commit crime just because the social pressure of another individual doing it will create an environment that supports criminal behavior. And then there's control theory, and there are conditions that restrain criminal behavior. This is the ever dream of criminal justice, that there are certain things that can restrain, control criminal behavior. And it's all comes down to, setting up particular patrols, things like that. Control theory says that we can impact crime directly through some kind of new activity or new prevention. Then we have to talk about psychological theories. And so one of the first ones, and it's going to get interesting, is psychodynamic theory. This comes from Sigmund Freud. And while 99% of Freud's work and beliefs have been disproven, and pseudoscience includes the ever classic Oedipus complex and Electra complex, the Oedipus complex, that a man has a desire to kill his father and marry his mother. Don't look any deeper into it if you've never heard of it before. Be glad you haven't. But something that Freud did put forward is that there are three individuals within a person. And I don't mean like they're three separate people, but we have three levels of desire. We have the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the base level, like, oh, I'm doing this because my primal ancestors say this. The super ego is the over the top following the rules kind of thing, and the ego is this weird in the middle spot. That's a very basic breakdown of this. Take Intro to Psychology to learn more about these, because all three of these, behavioral theory, cognitive theory, and psychodynamic theory, are all really interesting, and I like them in psychology, but trying to explain it in this tiny little focused area, it's not the same. So please take psychology if you haven't, to learn more about these. But so psychodynamic theory, the important piece here is that a lot of ways we look at criminal behavior is satisfying the need of the id, the basic human behavior. So behavioral theory is the idea that behavior is learned. This is part of that nature versus nurture idea. And so behavioral theory, if behavior is learned, it's nurture. So where did they learn said behavior? Was it through people they grew up with? Is it through their parents? Is it through their friends, family members, outside influences, that kind of thing? And cognitive theory looks at how individuals think and perceive the world around them. Cognitive theory, from a criminal justice standpoint, is by far one of the most interesting and important ones, because it's all about trying to figure out how people think and perceive. And this is why, simultaneously, crime analysts or people that profile individuals, it's a pseudoscience there, but it's like it all comes from cognitive theory, the idea that can we identify the way people respond and think and act, and will that lead to this kind of information? So it's very interesting. Like I said, I love psychology and I love these particular theories, but we don't have the time or space in this class to talk deeply about them. This is just surface level. And then we get into the biosocial theories. And so we have, biochemical conditions, which basic breakdown is hormonal imbalances, so that typically how we view this is that some criminal behavior can be connected to hormonal imbalances or a chemical imbalance within the brain, causing individuals to do things they normally would not do. Neuropsychological issues, these are just abnormalities in brain functioning, things of that nature. This last one, because I'm skipping the genetics and crime here for just a second, but arousal theory, we do what we like. This is very much that kind of Sigmund Freud id. We get to that base desire. We do what we like. Arousal theory is all about that. Some people commit crime because they enjoy the feeling of getting away with a crime or committing a crime. And so we do what we like. We continue to engage in activities that we shouldn't be doing, but we do anyway. And so, really, to wrap this up, because you'll see this is the end of the slideshow, but genetics and crime, nature versus nurture. And this is something to talk about because this is very, very debatable and something that, we've been arguing for at least a century, I want to say now, but perhaps longer. What has a bigger impact on human development? Is it nature, how we are born, our genetics, or is it nurture? Is it the way we were raised? And so, two of the studies that our text 2 brings up is twin studies, which show that there was a significant relationship between all types except for fraternal twins. They all had a close relationship if one committed some kind of crime or there was a predisposition for a crime for both individuals. It's very interesting. But adoption studies, this was an interesting thing. So they looked at the data, and across the board, 59% of adopted children who had committed a crime, there was genetics that led into a factor where a birth parent had committed similar crimes, and that has led to belief that there is genetic factors that point to criminal behavior. I emphasize this only because we have data, but at the same time, it's still a lot of unanswered questions. Just because a parent is a criminal, does that mean the kid is going to be a criminal? Not necessarily. They could be a very well-behaved member of society. And just because a parent is the model citizen doesn't mean that their child could never possibly be a criminal. Nature versus nurture has been the focused debate for a long time, but it really should be nature and nurture. There is a connection with both. And so, just my piece, but we need to find a way to bring them both together. All right, that's the lecture. That's all the notes I got for you all. Please make sure you're reading through the text, not just listening to my lecture. My lecture is the surface view from 50,000 feet, and I'm giving some additional information. But to get the whole thing, you need to listen to the lecture, read the textbook, that kind of thing. But thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll see you in the next one.